It was right after Newtown, and of course, you know, there was a chance there for about 6 months that we were going to get meaningful reform in terms of our gun laws. And I am right in the middle of things. You know, we're all students, right? Are guns the problem? Well, the right answer is yes, no, and maybe, right? That's the answer to every important question, and that's my answer. So in other words, I have lots of friends on the left, and I have lots of friends in the NRA, which is interesting. But I also have people who really are out there who absolutely hate the middle. And so I made the mistake of talking about the National Firearms Act of 1934. How many of you know that law? Because the National Firearms Act of 1934 was a successful piece of legislation. And I tried to argue that, you know, mass murder is different from everyday murder. Certainly you can commit mass murder with a sniper rifle, you can do it with a shotgun, but you can do it far more effectively with high-powered technology. And we had a problem in our country of mass killings with Thompson submachine guns, fully automatic weapons, a lot of law enforcement officers, a lot of gang violence in the 1920s and teens. We had a lot of dynamite murders by anarchists and other people trying to blow up our public officials and dynamite the police and dynamite their rivals in organized crime. And of course, there were a lot of assassinations being done with silencers. So what the government did, interestingly enough, it didn't outlaw anything, didn't require anybody to give anything back. What they decided was to put a very heavy tax on purchase of those kinds of things and require licensing. So you had to have a real reason to have it. So all those Thompson submachine guns are still out there. In fact, they're worth like $30,000 a piece, and you wouldn't just give them away to somebody who's a criminal. I mean, that's a valuable piece of property. But what was interesting is even though you can still buy a fully automatic weapon if you're licensed, if you pay the tax. You can still get dynamite if you have a good reason to do it. But you can't just go to the store and pick it up. And what's interesting, my mistake was to say, how many of us were killed by dynamite last year? How many of us were killed with a fully automatic weapon? How many of us were killed with a silencer? Well, the answer is 0. And I said, it's the same thing that we've done with planes. When they killed people at the World Trade Center, we hardened the cockpits, and now you can't use that as a mass murder weapon. So I said, you know, there are things there that can work. And that got me in trouble. They didn't mention that anywhere. I'm all over YouTube being slandered and my whole talks being chopped up. But they even managed to take things that I said about primates' behavior, which I'll talk a little bit today, and things I said about political polarization between Republicans and Democrats. And of course, how did they splice that? On the YouTube, I call Republicans chimpanzees. This is where they are. So anyway, that's why I really want to have this on tape and posted. If I say something stupid, by God, I deserve what I get, you know. But when I say something informed, when we as scholars have really worked hard, and the truth is in between. I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. It's very clearly, to me, an individual right. It always was intended that in common law. It's intended that in the Declaration of Rights of 1689, for Protestants at least, and, you know, English Protestants. And so it's something that, you know, we have to think about balance. And balance is not popular with some people. So I we even had to have a security plan. I didn't think anything about all the threats that I was getting. And then it turned out the campus, my chair got the campus police involved. And I guess some of those people are really dangerous. So like we had a security plan, and the police were going by our house 4 times until until they defeated the legislation. And then they went away. But one of the interesting things about what they do with an OSU security plan, you may want to know this, they want you to turn around your desk so you're facing your door. I mean, like, why do I want to know I'm going to get shot? You know, I didn't understand that. You know, a simple bullet in the back of the head does the job really well. And then I wouldn't know. So anyway, you know, but when you're getting your life threatened, they want you to turn around and watch. I just thought that was very effective, you know. It's not like our offices, we don't have back doors, right? I mean, there's nowhere to, like, bail. In fact, our first floor, the first floor, you need the specialized tool that only our secretary has to open that window. Anyway, so I just spent 5 minutes talking about my life. And it can get really rough when you talk about violence. You know, I've been attacked by all sides. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about today is really talk a little bit about the cost of the problem. And I know a lot of you, because you're in public policy, are comfortable with statistics. But a lot of times people aren't. You know, they can't tell the difference. You know, when you look at a rate of homicide, our homicide rate for really 2/3 of the last 100 years has been 9 per 100,000 persons per year. And if you're not a statistician, that sounds like pretty good odds. You know, 9 out of 100,000 times, you know, that means 99,991 times I'm not going to be dead. I'm not going to be murdered this year. But the fact is that the rate is not your risk. Your risk is something you face that rate, your cohort faces that rate every year of your life. So the chance you're going to get murdered is not 9 out of 100,000. It's 9 out of 100,000 times your life expectancy. And it's differential for different groups. So if you look at it overall, when we were running those rates at our life expectancy we have today, if we were to continue those rates, 1 out of every 140 children born in the United States would grow up to be murdered. That's a lot of murder. And it's differential. So for instance, the kind of statistics we have going back are not really very flexible. We really have crude measures, white, non-white, male, female. But if those rates, if they kept up in the kinds of homicide rates we ran at our peak, 1 out of every 460 white females would be killed, about 1 in 142 white males, about 1 in every 112 non-white females, and 1 of every 27 non-white males. So those rates, at least that we've been running lately, are huge. Even when we look at us being down at about 5 per 100,000, which we are now, which is our low point, we've been about a third of the last 100 years we've been down there. And then say from in the late 1930s through into the early 1960s, we were down at about where we are today. But even at those rates, you're talking almost 1 every 200 children born in our country is going to be murdered. And when, you know, we're way above any other affluent society. So the question is, you know, why is this? And I wanted to note, you know, that it hasn't always been this way. You know, I'm ahead of my clicker now. But, you know, when we look at it, some of the interesting things we've discovered is that African Americans, really from the mid-18th century right on through Reconstruction, were probably the least likely of all Americans to commit murder, not the most likely. Those lines crossed the 1890s to the 1930s, and that's when the gains of the Civil War were nullified by Jim Crow, legal segregation, disfranchisement, the murder of the black political leadership and economic leadership. And you see that young black men arm themselves, particularly in the South, and really start to go postal in terms of all kinds of situations. And when they carry around those guns with a lot of anger behind them, you don't end up defending yourself against being lynched. You end up shooting other African Americans in social situations, at church, at parties, things like that, red parties and such. So that's a different thing. We don't think about the fact that in the North and the Mountain South, after the American Revolution, we probably had the lowest homicide rate in the Western world. We can't imagine that anymore. It just doesn't compute because we think of ourselves as a violent people. But we haven't always been. And really, when we look at the South, this is not a moral judgment on it, because we often think that non-lethal violence and lethal violence are intimately intertwined. But in fact, the South, the antebellum South, had what we'd call a moderate homicide rate by European standards. It was a terribly brutal and violent society in a non-lethal way. But you can imagine, you know, killing your slave property isn't exactly a smart thing to do. So what you'll see is that, you know, as much violence as there is there, and we do see violence going up, homicidal violence going up after the revolution of the South, but after a revolution it went down in the rest of the country, outside of the slave South. So these kinds of things, what looks like it's always been here, isn't always here. You look at possessive violence against women, you know, an ex-boyfriend, an ex-spouse who will kill you, you know, for leaving him or breaking the relationship. You can find virtually none of those before the 1830s or 40s in American history. It's a crime that you just don't see much of. So it's interesting to see how these things change over time. Now, what I'd like to talk about a little bit is how different kinds of crime, homicide, are. I'm going to begin by looking at child murder. I've just got a few slides here. But what we found is that what drives my new work is on child murder. History. I'm writing a history of murders of and by children from colonial times to the present, which is a companion volume to my book that I published in 2009, American Homicide, which is the murders among adults from colonial times to present. So I deal with all kinds of murders in that, domestic violence, as well as intimate partner violence, as well as stranger violence, violence among friends. Child murder follows these really interesting curves right through the end of the 19th, early 20th century. These long, smooth curves. They go up and down. They inflect over, several hundred years. This one inflects from the 1630s down, and then it comes up in the 19th century. And I could push this one out now even farther, and you'll see these long, slow movements. Whereas when we look at something like homicide rates among unrelated adults, they're very jagged. In other words, we can double or triple our homicide rate between the mid-60s and the early 70s, and we can drop our homicide rate by really a third to a half all of a sudden in the mid to late 90s. Those are very jagged. They can spike. Whereas the child murder rates seem to be much more even. And here we have the murders of older children. This is an interesting thing, that spike up there early in murders of older children. But this is the neonaticides, and this one here is the murders of children, older children, by parents or caregivers. And then this one here is the murders of children by non-relatives. And it turns out the murders of children by non-relatives, they tend to follow the homicide rate among unrelated adults. But these here that are by relatives or caregivers, they really follow these smooth curves. You'll notice once your ends get up high enough in New England, our denominators get high enough, the smooth curve and the real curve become identical, and they just merge. It's stunning when you get enough data, it just goes like that. And so the question is, what's driving that? And it took me, I've got to say, being a social science historian, whenever I gather a new set of data, my response is either, what the heck, or, oh no. I mean, because you watch your theories just die a horrible death in the face of the evidence. I mean, time and again, you always get surprised. I always tell my students, if you want to be original, just work, because there's so much out there that we just don't have a clue about. And so when you do this, when I first saw these curves, I thought I had no idea. So I started throwing other data at it that I'd collected, that other colleagues had collected, and everywhere I've looked, New England, Ohio, the Chesapeake, France, England, it's the inverse of the birth rate. Every single place, it's the inverse of the birth rate. So when the birth rate is high, the murder rate of children by parents or caregivers is low, and vice versa. When the birth rate goes down, the murder rate of children by parents or caregivers goes up. And what drives the birth rate then is what's driving child murder. And of course, in the late 16th, early 17th century, what's really driving it is economic want. In other words, we know that the income for the poorest 40% of the population in England dropped by a third, their real income. They didn't have enough food actually to work an 8-hour day. They could work maybe 4 hours a day. They were so malnourished. And so in that desperate situation, you can watch the neonaticide rates spike. And you can especially see them spike during famines when essentially the wheat prices go up like that. They just spike, property crime spikes, and you see these spikes in neonaticide. And of course, this drop here in the 19th century in fertility, really we think is rising ambition, much more so. We do think the average person was better off. We don't see a miseration of the poor, although the poor don't gain as fast as the wealthy do. It's not a lack of food. It's that people really are focusing more attention on fewer children. In other words, they want fewer children and a better life for them. We see women decide to start childbearing later and end it sooner. They want a kind of life, and we see that their husbands, their boyfriends, many of them share that same ambition. And so the problem is really what happens when children come in the wrong numbers, with the wrong qualities, the wrong time, wrong situation. So ambition is something that we think about too. Let's see. But here we have, you see, age at mother at first birth. When the world is welcoming to children, that is, when women have children at a young age, they feel they can, the murder rate of children is low. When that age at first birth goes up, it becomes a problem. We look at the premarital pregnancy rate, and that's an interesting one. Actually, when there are lots of out-of-wedlock children, that's a welcoming situation for children. It means there's not that pressure. What we see is that the premarital pregnancy rate goes down when there is pressure on fertility. You know, it's either economic want or rising ambition. And so children get killed. We see it coincides with life expectancy. It coincides with adult heights. It coincides with virtually every measure of welfare of children and of their young parents. So this one is really pretty straightforward to us, you know, that really it seems to me that child murder at the aggregate level is a function of the cost of children, relative parental resources, and parental ambitions for themselves and their children. Now, this correlation is going to start to dissolve when effective birth control comes in the late 19th century. You see, for the first time, the rates are going to go down. Birth rate goes down, and the neonaticide rate goes down. Infanticide goes down, because you're starting to get effective control. But what I'm working on now, because our data is so bad, I'm trying to collect data in Ohio to really get this as right as we can. We think there's still an echo of it. And if you take a look at the kind of work that's being done in Greater Columbus and Greater Pittsburgh at our children's hospitals, there's an effort to really investigate every single death of a child. Fetal deaths, infant deaths, child deaths. These are child death reviews, infant death reviews, to try to check out, you know, the assumption isn't that there's foul play, but of course they found a lot more foul play than they thought. Now that we have radiological means of looking at shaken baby syndrome, something that historically we just can't look at. But these kinds of things are very significant. And what's fascinating is, I've talked to my colleagues there, and they've been doing just state-of-the-art work. And they watched that the kinds of things that I've seen historically still apply. In other words, they knew to the month when the recession of 2001 started and the recession in December 2007. And they saw it in the battered bodies of children. In other words, it's a leading economic indicator. They could tell from child abuse when the economy starts to turn south months before the economists or any business leader or any government leader would have a clue, because that's what happens when young families start to get stressed. And it's an interesting question when we take a look at, I write on the biology of this and have thought about this a lot. And when we take a look at what the stress hormone cortisol does to you. Of course, cortisol can increase in your body for all kinds of reasons, but a lost relationship, frustrated ambition, economic want, all these things can lead to a higher cortisol level. And it's interesting to think what happens with species like ours that engage in cooperative child rearing. Our species, you know, there's about a fifth of all primates that engage in what's called cooperative child rearing. In other words, the nutritional demands of having that child or that group of children is so high that the female cannot do it by herself. She needs help from siblings, she needs help from daughters, she needs help from a significant other. This is true for marmosets, tamarins, a lot of these species, and we're one of those species. And we're the only ones that have female infanticide, or maternal infanticide. Because essentially, in these species, you know, do I have enough help? Do I have enough resources? And we'll see that the tamarins and the marmosets calculate this out with their very small brains compared to ours. And they will simply, if there aren't the resources out there, or if they don't have the help of their significant other they mate for life, they will kill the next litter. They'll just kill it. They have a sense of this. And they'll kill their daughters' litters to keep theirs alive. Now, when we think about what happens to us with cortisol, I'm thinking particularly with mothers, we're quite aware that if you have an elevated level of cortisol, the new work shows that you are less likely to conceive a child because it interferes with your follicular and luteal phase. So that your body is telling you, millions of years of evolution are telling you it's not the time to have another. That's what your body's doing. If you have a high level of cortisol, you're 3 times more likely to miscarry in the first 3 weeks. So all of these things are telling your body right now is a bad time. And if you have that elevated level of cortisol when your child is born, you have a harder time bonding with it. What happens is essentially that when you have a normal cortisol response, when your baby cries, suddenly you're alert. Suddenly, and that gets you attached, actually. It doesn't distress you. But if you're up here in your cortisol and stress level, that extra thing, that extra input either goes by you or drives you at a higher level. So what we see is that women who have a higher level of cortisol stress are more likely to neglect their children. So all of these things are patterned into the biology, we think, as well as into, our social structure. So that's the kind of thing I'm working on now. Do you have any questions about that? That's what I work on now. It's actually the easiest part. It seems that child murder actually makes sense. I mean, the most horrible thing you can think of makes perfect sense. But killing other adults, especially unrelated adults, it's really wacky. And that's a real hard thing to explain. A question, anybody? Sure. Facultative? Oh, what's facultative adaptation? I forgot about this. I write about this. Facultative adaptation is this. In other words, if you have animals that have evolved in unstable social and natural habitats, and we as humans live very often in unstable social habitats as well as unstable natural habitats, those species that survive have what's called facultative adaptation. In other words, what you can do is, as the environment changes, you can change your behavior. To give you an example, say you have a situation in which there's lots of food and few predators in a lake. The fish that are going to really, if that's stable, then you want the fish to be not very anxious about looking around and just an eating machine. And they'll outcompete anything else. If you have a situation in which there are lots of predators around, you're going to want, and that's stable, you're going to have fish that are able to dart around and eat furtively. They're going to survive. What happens if you have a situation if it's unstable? 1 month there's a lot of predators, the next month there aren't any. The species that's going to win out is the one that can sense that in their environment. If you can sense the change in your environment and behave accordingly, you have an advantage. And what we think is that human beings and the marmosets and tamarins have enough intellectual capacity to perceive difference. They're picking up signs that they can see in their environment, but their bodies are doing things too that they're wholly unaware of, that we can pick up what biologists would call a cue. In other words, we couldn't articulate why we're feeling the way we are, and we're not even aware of how our bodies are changing in order to adapt to that situation. But we are adapting to it. So it's sort of, you could call it conscious and unconscious if you wanted to, or semi-conscious. A lot of our behavior we know as human beings is unconscious or unaware or semi-aware. But the thing is our bodies are changing hormonally as we deal with these situations. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about how our bodies change according to the political situation. And we can see that happens with chimpanzees and vervets and baboons and all of them. When there's periods of political instability, it affects their hormones, it affects their bodies, it affects the level of aggression. And I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to think that we do that too. And so I'm going to talk about that now. The thing is, we don't have a lot of research on this yet. What I really always said I wanted to have, I tell my students, I tell them, what are students for? But for experiments, right? And I said, what I really want to have, we can't do the kinds of things that they're actually doing with some of the primates, like they sacrifice their brains and see how their brain tissue changes over time. I don't want to do that to my undergraduates or my graduate students. All I want is a constant digital readout of the hormone levels in your cerebrospinal fluid. Now, I have to tell you, before we do this, just disclosure, putting the probe into your spinal canal is a little tricky, but I assure you that the risk of death is very small. And, this would be a great contribution to science if we could see you under every sort of situation you're in. We'll plant a camera on your head and do all that and just have you walk around the rest of your life. And then we'll be able to understand this, I swear. I think the IRB would have a little trouble with that. So mostly what we're working with is animal models and things. Yeah? Frustrated ambition. The thing is we are trying to measure it. We're trying to figure out how to measure a lot of things. I'll show you some of the things we're measuring. And one of the things that we're really, as humanistic historians, and this is one of the things I've asked all my friends in demography about it, because so many of their theories are based on frustrated ambition. And how do we measure it? What we can really see, what we can measure as social science historians, and what we can see as humanistic historians, is you can actually watch the rise in ambition coming in, say, in the revolutionary period to after. You see young people starting to delay marriage. We see a rise in abstinence. We see a rise in young women's interests about their bodies. We start to see more publications and wider distribution of those, really looking at what's called female health, but essentially that's reproductive health. We see more and more evidence in correspondence that young couples are really concerned about not getting pregnant and really controlling the number of children. We can see it in the architecture where when husband and wife get to be 35, they have separate rooms until they're 50. They actually just get 2 separate beds and they move out. We can see this happening in the 1830s and 40s. You can see young women getting more interested in education. And so the female literacy rate jumps. We've always talked about female literacy rates and rising ambition and control of fertility. So we can measure that. And we can see that. We can see that young women are more likely to leave their hometowns to search for better employment. They're less likely to marry a guy in their hometown. They're choosy. They're looking around. There's all these signs that we see, particularly among women, that their ambitions are rising. And when you start to look at the kinds of economic constraints that they're under by the 1830s and 40s, you see the rise in infanticide. You also see tailing down of the prospects for the young men who they're marrying economically, their chance of self-employment. So we look at all of those things, letters, diaries, etc. It's humanistic. And what I'm doing in some of the things here is I am coming up with new measures of things, measures of political instability. I'll show you some of those. I'll show you measures of fellow feeling that we're coming up with. But the tough thing is to really look at that over a long period of time. You know, we're trying to do some big data things. But right now, big data things are a big risk. It's got to be content analysis. I'll give you a very good example of content analysis. You can take a look at the way that romantic ideas filtered down into the public with some beautiful content analysis done of American periodicals. And they looked at basic romantic ideas, you know, about love and romance. And they looked in particular at 2 of the ideas that I think are the most dangerous ideas that have ever come down the pike having to do with romance. I tell my students these are dangerous ideas. My spouse and I love my spouse dearly, but we're anti-romantics in this sense. And these 2 ideas, we are destined for one and only one person, and you can only find yourself through true love. Those are very dangerous ideas, very dangerous. And what you can see is those ideas come into vogue in the 1830s and 40s at the exact decades that young men can't take rejection. You just watch it and boom, it just times perfectly. And you can see the same things in terms of spousal murders. When you have stability, you don't have many spousal murders, you see a kind of consensus in this literature. The husband's in charge, the wife has subtle influence. When you come to the 1830s and 40s, when spouse murder increases, you see the culture is confused. About a third of the article says the husband should run the household. About a quarter say the wife should run the household. A third say there should be subtle influence, or a quarter say we should be equals. So you've got a quarter. You've got cultural confusion and cultural debate. And it's at that moment that you see people are not able to negotiate these differences. And you see this surge in homicide by husbands who can't meet this new Victorian ideal. So we look at this kind of stuff very carefully. But I'll give you a hint here. What's the best correlate of the homicide rate among unrelated adults from colonial times right through into the 20th century? If you were going to measure something, what would you measure? It's the percentage of new counties in any decade that's named after national heroes. If you think about it, it makes sense. When that number is high, do you think the homicide rate is going to be high or low? When we name things after national heroes, what's going to happen to the homicide rate? It's going to drop. When we stop naming our new counties for national heroes, this is the British period and the American period, it goes up. And that's the kind of thing I look at. But that's all after the fact. I had all these, we didn't know what the data was before. So now we have some data, and I keep throwing everything I can at it. I read this book, well, let's try that. Let's try this. I come up with my own things. Let's try this. And if I were to come up in the 19th century and ask you one word will track the homicide rate in the 19th century United States, it's the N-word. The incidence of that use of that word tracks the homicide rate in the United States in the 19th century. So when you start to think about these kinds of things, they start to make sense. But it's not where you'd start, is it? It's not where you'd start. Does that help answer? Yeah. So we're trying. It's really something that we're working on now, and I wish we could get more money to do it and some people to help out, because we have very few quantitative historians anymore. Virtually all historians are anti-quantitative. So we don't have many people who love math anymore who will do this kind of grunt work. So we need social scientists. Anybody want to play? I would like that. So you have a question?
Well, my question is the 1830s and 1840s, what you described there for males in the United States, was the same case in Europe as far as you know?
Oh, I'm going to show you.
The end of the store converge period.
Yeah, I've got Europe up here. I'll get there. Okay. So Europe is up here. So this is something I talked about, how variable these things are. And we think about, the problem is that typical liberal and conservative explanations don't work. I don't have time to go into this. I could. But one of the things that really hits me is that violence is among unrelated adults, is one of those issues where liberalism and conservatism both don't work. In other words, there's other things driving these things. And so I could talk about why I disagree. My colleagues and I disagree with all of these theories and such, but we do. It just doesn't correlate with these kinds of things. But it correlates with these four things. This is my work. And it really correlates like this really up until the 1970s. And in some ways, it's still doing this. But as I'm going to talk about, the massive public interventions we have, particularly with mass incarceration, particularly with hotspots policing, particularly with therapeutic drugs, for depression and other things, are really having an impact. So that what we see really in the last 50 years or 40 years is going to be dampened considerably. In other words, the things that would normally be driving homicide rates up and down really don't have quite the ability to drive them up that they used to. When you have so many people on mood-altering drugs, when you have so many people in prison. Right now, African-American males ages 25 to 44, 1 out of 10 of them is in prison as we sit here. So when you put 10% of your high-risk population in prison, something's going to happen. Especially what's happening is they're not killing each other. They can't kill each other. You look at it right now, we have, for the white males, their incarceration rates are tremendously high too. It's just stunning how many people are in prison. And if you take a look at, say, a very high-risk cohort, say, I'm getting ahead to the end here before I get in the middle, but say if you take a look at high school dropouts, male high school dropouts born between 1975 and 79, what fraction of the white males in that group, high school dropouts, ended up in prison? 1 out of 6. For African Americans, it's 2 out of 3. So essentially, you're taking your disfranchised population and throwing away, locking them up and throwing away the key. And I don't want to believe that I see all the damage that imprisonment does. I do not support this. I think these other ways limiting violence are the ways we should go. But it's really been a blunt tool, and it's frightening to think of those numbers. It really is. So, I mean, I was looking at this at the peak. We had 3 out of every 100 African males in lockdown detention between the ages of 10 and 14. I mean, it's really stunning, these numbers that we have, that we've been running. Okay, but anyway, it has to do with political stability. It has to do with a sense that the government is legitimate, having confidence in it and who runs it, and the officials, the belief in their legitimacy. A sense of fellow feeling and empathy, patriotism, empathy, and kinship with others, members of society arising from racial, religious, or political solidarity. Yes, it's scary to see that racism works. You know, racial solidarity in a very bad sense can work. I mean, look at what happened when Mussolini took over. Homicide rate plummeted. That kind of, you know, it's essentially, this is about successful nation building, isn't it? Nation building can be a wonderful process. It can be a brutal and bloody and mean process. We all know that who study politics, right? And the thing is that for the people who are on the inside of that successful nation, even if they project their violence outward against minorities in their society or externally, their homicide rate can go down. So there are things there that I don't want to know any more than I want to know that prison might and diminish homicide to some extent. I just don't want to know what I know. I started out with very happy assumptions about what would bring us together and, you know, have a kumbaya moment. But unfortunately, we're human beings, big chimps. So, and then legitimate status hierarchy. I could talk about that, but I'm going to talk, it'll take me a while to get at that. But here we are, Corsica, 19th century. We know in France that every time there was a revolution, 1830-31, 1848-50, 1870-71, there's a spike in homicide. And it's not just in Paris where the political violence is. It's even in Corsica. This is Corsica. Corsica, they can't even speak French. None of this is political violence. It's all feud violence. It's all honor violence. And what's interesting, you can see these patterns when our homicide rate spikes in the mid-19th century. It's not just spiking in New York City, where there's lots of Irish immigration. It's spiking in Cleveland, where it's German immigration. It's spiking in Ross County, which is Southern extraction. It's even spiking in Holmes County. Mennonite and Amish country. When the country goes a certain way, even the Amish and the Mennonites, this is very weird to me. But it's saying that there's very deep things going on. In other words, everybody goes up and down together. And it's a stunning thing to see. And this is what we're seeing in Corsica here. Somehow they know. And it's fascinating. Here what we have is England and Wales. What's fascinating, and this takes some doing, but really you see a settlement during the Napoleonic Wars. There's a great deal of social unrest by the working classes, by the middle class, about their political disfranchisement, about their economic hardships. And there's this understanding that when the Napoleonic Wars are over, we will get to solving this problem in England, but without a revolution, without violence. And what you see is the British elite, as soon as the wars are over in 1815, they renege on that deal. They just say, back to status quo holds. And when the Democratic protesters came out at Peterloo, they gunned them down. And what you see is once the Democratic surge, the demand for democratic rights was nullified, you'll see that the homicide rate spikes all the way through the Chartist period. And what you come to is 1867, and it drops like a rock. And 1884, it drops like a rock. What happened? 1867 is when propertyless household heads in the cities gained the right to vote. And 1884 is when propertyless household heads in the countryside gained the right to vote. And overnight, the murder rate dropped like a rock. Just like that. And so we're talking about legitimacy. We're talking about empowerment. We're talking about a sense that you matter, that you're included. And how that affects the way, what's weird is that affects whether you commit robbery murder. It affects whether you kill your best friend in a bar fight. It affects whether or not you rape and murder a young woman you don't know. It's very strange to see that these kinds of patterns drive those things to a huge surge in homicide where they went up to really kind of our Civil War rates, really terrible rates. If you take a look at Eastern Europe, you'll see that the nations that made the most successful transition to democratic capitalism, their rates are coming back down towards what they used to be. And that, of course, is Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic. But you'll see that Bulgaria and Romania, which have had more difficulties, are way up here. What we think we're seeing, again, is that, political instability, political change can be very disruptive. We can see that in every primate when they end up in a fight over the dominance hierarchy comes into play. You see their hormone levels go up, serotonin goes down, testosterone goes up for males and females. Everybody starts whacking on each other. You get political stability again. Everybody secretes more serotonin, less testosterone. They stop whacking on each other. And so the question is, I think we're like that, but I can't prove it because we can't really, I need that digital readout in your spinal canal. So if you just volunteer, I'm not going to volunteer, it's dangerous, but if you want to go ahead, that's fine by me. Okay, now this is really, I just want to show you here some of the things we're doing here. I'm looking at deadly riots. I'm looking at banishments. I'm looking at executions for sedition or treason. I'm looking at community executions over witchcraft or moral issues or heresy. I'm looking for things, signs of division in the community, signs for division within the political system. And so I've measured all these things out for colonial America, and you'll see that it works perfectly. You have a high homicide rate up until the King Philip's War and the revolution of Glorious Revolution. You see a period of low homicide right on through into the mid-1760s, and with the Stamp Act crisis, you see it go up. And then as the revolution, post-revolutionary settlement comes in, goes back down again, and that's a map of the homicide rate in the colonial period in the United States. So I'm trying to measure these kinds of things. Again, I'm measuring these things after the fact to try to see if my theory works, and thank God it worked. Like I counted this stuff feverishly for months, and it turned out to work. Here's your counties named after national heroes. You'll see that is in that middle period. When it's high is when you have that low homicide rate. This is, you see the same thing with political violence, deadly political riots in the 19th century. There's the N-word, and this is your homicide rate spiking after the Mexican War, going up right on through Reconstruction, coming down, and then with disfranchisement and legal segregation in the 1890s, it goes up again. And so these kinds of words track the homicide rate. And here's the homicide rate in the United States over here. And here's the percentage of Americans who say they trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. And it tracked very well until 2004. And now, actually, the American National Election Survey can't ask the question anymore because it's been fouled by partisanship. In other words, you answer no if the other guys are in charge. Before then, we answered honestly. In other words, whether or not we felt this was a great country or how we felt. But since then, it's been entirely turned partisan. And one of the other things we've been trying to track it with things like, do you believe that young people will be better off in 5 years? That's another good one. But that is now at one of our lowest levels ever. But our homicide rate's down, right? But who is saying that young people are going to be worse off 5 years from now? It's the wealthiest Americans. We're staying, sort of class warfare from above is what we're experiencing, I think, to a great extent in our country right now. And the angriest group in our society is the most privileged group in our society. So all these opinion polls are just flipping in all kinds of weird ways, thanks to the political situation that we're in. So you can't really use these questions anymore the way we used to. So we're trying to figure out, how do I measure it? One thing that was interesting to me is to take a look that I predicted this, and we still have a lot of work to do because the data isn't really polished enough yet. But I predicted online that if candidate Obama won the election of 2008, I thought the homicide rate would drop like a rock in American cities right after the election. because of what this would mean for African Americans and for other minorities. I thought this was just something we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. I'm 63. I said, this can't possibly happen. But it did. And I was very worried what would happen in the white supremacist areas, the most virulently white supremacist areas of our country. And sure enough, the 6 months afterward, this is still preliminary data. We don't have data from every agency, even for literally 2009, 2010. It's bad data, a lot of it. But what you saw is the homicide rate right after the election, those 6 months, dropped by 15% in American cities. It dropped to 8.5% across the nation. There was this sort of general decline, a general feeling of uplift after that election. But if you take a look at the parts of the South that were most involved in the birther movement, believe is illegitimate, those areas, as we map them out, it went up 10%. So you'll see this kind of flipping sort of thing. You'll see this even that black mistrust in government, white mistrust in government track differently, and so do their homicide rates. So we work on these kinds of things, and how do we get it refined is what we're working on, but we need better data. Okay, now the thing I wanted to talk about here is just looking at it internationally. One thing that we see, if we look at all these nations together, not just the United States, we'll see that everybody had an increase in the mid-60s, really peaking in the 80s, which looks just like us. And then the pivot point to drop here for the affluent world is 1988 to 1992. And again, that's the end of the Cold War. It's an interesting thing we're thinking about. If that somehow, is going to change the way people see democratic capitalism, collapse of the communist left, etc. But these things do fit together. And so we're really trying to figure out in bigger relief what's happening here. This is the question. And we figured out that, so our National Academy of Sciences panel that I'm on, we're trying to figure out, we're tasked to find the crime, what reasons for the crime drop in the 1990s. And the problem is we found out there wasn't one. If you take a look at this, you'll see that what happened actually is that for everybody age 25 and older, the crime drop has been coming since the mid-70s. It's almost steadily down for the older age groups. So it's not a 1990s phenomenon at all. It's a persistent, long thing. And what you'll see is all the age groups went up and down together. And that's the way we think it's been through most of history. But for some reason, for the first time we've ever seen this in U.S. history, really, in the mid-'80s, you see this spike in the homicide rates by the young white males, and we'll see that it's for the young black males too. This spike, 1985 to 2000. Boom, up like that, a slight echo here. But everybody else is going down, and then they become part of that downward trend after that. We take a look for black male homicide rates. You see a little echo here, up age 20 to 24. It's really youth violence. It's under the age of 20. We see them spike. But you notice that actually the decline in black homicide started really in the early 70s. Really, it peaks in 72, and it's been going down almost steadily for everybody age 25 and older. What's scary is that correlates perfectly with the imprisonment rate for people age 25 and older. It doesn't correlate with the imprisonment rates for younger people because they're being imprisoned at a much higher rate and they spike. So we can't say, you've got a strong correlation between declining homicide and incarceration age 25 and older. You don't have that quite for the younger group. And that's a puzzle too. Although there may be a way to explain that, and this is going to be my last remark, what's interesting is we often think about prison not working. We say it's a revolving door, people always go back. Well, that's true the second time. But the first time you're sent to prison, how many people never ever go back to prison? 2 out of 3. There is a learning curve in prison. And 2 out of 3 people go to prison and said, I think I'm going to change my life. I think this sucks. And so you're going to see them change. And so really, I think when you talk about the people you're incarcerating age 25 and older, you are getting you're essentially getting the population, we think, that is really your repeat offenders. They're having a very hard time rehabilitating and reintegrating and therefore they're pretty much being thrown away right now. So in other words, we're not sure if imprisonment is really targeting the right people, if that's what you want to do. Again, the whole thing is horrifying to me. There are better ways. Building a legitimate society is a much better way to lower a homicide rate, a much more just way to do it. But very few societies, most really other nations are doing that, although they have, many of them, racial homogeneity and racism working in their favor. In other words, the fact that they're prejudiced against outsiders actually is a benefit to them. I think that's particularly true for places like Japan. We don't have that. So I would actually say, still in my heart, I have this feeling that in many ways we're the least prejudiced society on the face of the earth, but we're the most diverse other than Canada. Canada's more diverse than we are. But we're the second most diverse society in the world. And so what prejudice we have hurt people. They do a lot of damage. So it doesn't mean that we're the most prejudiced. That's not at all what I want to say. But I would say that, it's a problem. All these kinds of things that divide us. And when you take a look at the Americans comparatively, my friends who do this work, who are Europeans, say they just can't imagine the extent to which Americans hate their government. And they can't imagine the extent to which, so many Americans will say, I'm an American and you're not. That kind of impulse has been there really in spades since when? Since our Civil War. And so the echoes of that Civil War, that hatred of government, that hatred of each other, it just is a gift that keeps on giving. And so it's a very hard thing to dampen down again, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, questions? Anything? There's my rant. I tried to do a lot. Yeah.
You mentioned the cortisol levels having an effect on women. Do you trace that into the next generation? Because the cortisol levels while a child is in utero make them more sensitive to it too.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And the thing is that if your HPA axis is damaged, which is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, which really controls your cortisol response. If that can be damaged in utero, so you come out, in other words, your body comes out highly stressed because you're prepared for the same stressful environment as your mother. The fact is, if you put a human child into a nurturing situation, if that mother gets to a place where her levels go down and she can parent properly, what you see is that axis can heal in a human being. It can heal all the way through adolescence. So in other words, there's a capacity for healing there that we see. So you don't want to make it too hereditary. But if you, Kathy Payer, outstanding person at Children's Hospital who we lost, she did these random samples of young women who are at risk. And what she would do is she'd give them cortisol tests at age 12. In other words, just hitting puberty. They aren't mothers and gives them a battery of psychological tests. And she can predict with 80% accuracy who's going to abuse their children and who's not, just by testing them at age 12. So by that time, things are pretty harder to change. Yeah. But those things can go on giving. These things have been studied far more in women than they have in men. It's one of the few things that have been studied more in women than in men. So we don't understand a lot of things about the male hormones related to parenting. But the latest work is suggesting that when a human male, when we bond with a woman, girlfriend, we're in a relationship, our testosterone goes down. If we spend a lot of time in our adolescence caring for children, our testosterone level goes down. When we become fathers, our testosterone level goes down again. So down, 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 down. As I say, I'm a teacher. I like everybody's children. So where am I? Maybe there's not much testosterone left. I don't know. But you see these kinds of things. And testosterone prepares you for aggression. It doesn't cause the aggression. It's not causing aggression. It's not as dangerous as a low serotonin level. Low serotonin level really facilitates impulsive aggression. So that's something that you really don't want to be low on. You can be high on testosterone and be rational. What's interesting about these male levels, when we think about the male levels, is when you have upset political instability in vervet monkeys or baboons and these other groups, which males go to the top? It's the ones with the highest testosterone and the lowest serotonin. When you have a situation of political stability, who goes to the top? The ones with moderate levels. You're not a pushover, but you're not the most aggressive. You're the best actually at politics, at making alliances, at keeping people happy, at grooming people. So what you see, and we can see this, I mean, when you look at political stability, what kind of guys get to the top? I mean, a lot of times they are really, really, I mean, take a look. And it may be that they're hormonally quite different from the rest of us, who in the normal setting, you know, being in the middle may work the same way in human situations, in human societies, that it does in these other primate societies. But we just don't know. So I think about us, males, too. Yeah.
Another question about your research perspective, the logic. Most of what the kinds of inferences you've drawn are like inferences to the best explanation.
Mm-hmm.
More like abduction rather than deduction or induction.
Is
that the standard historical approach, or is that?
The thing is I just told you that what did I predict would happen if Obama got elected? I stuck my neck out. I predicted it. In fact, I said after 9/11, I stuck my neck out and I said the homicide rate's not going to change at all, and I was right. The thing is, you know, what do I have to do? I've been predicting the homicide rate changes for 15 years. And the thing that really gets me is that, you know, I get that argument all the time. I mean, what my theory said is, you know, the state breakdown's the key. The Mexican War is the key. It's not the Civil War. It's when the political system broke down and lost legitimacy. So the thing is and my NSF grants were done just this way. It was not induction at all. What I did is when I first came up with this theory, I said to the NSF, they gave me money. I said, look, if this theory is right, I want to study the Shenandoah Valley, I want to study the Chesapeake in Virginia, and I want to study the Georgia backcountry during the Revolution. Because if I'm right, it will go up in the Chesapeake, it will spike in Georgia, and it'll stay flat or go down in the Shenandoah Valley. Because we know the politics, we know the history. Now, every theory I had before died when I tried to test it. This one I've tested, and I've tested, and I've tested, and I've tested, and it works. So the thing is, have I studied everything? No. But the point is that's how we do our work. I'm a social science historian. We cannot stop the world and run it over again and change just one thing. But what we can do is look at a lot of different places over long periods of time and put our theses at risk. And that's what I do every day. That's why I'm doing the contemporary stuff, because I want to figure this out. Why my book on child murder isn't done? Because it's been done for 12 years through the early 20th century, but the data's bad. And I don't want to write a book with implications for public policy without testing the theory. So that's how we do our work. I mean, I am very proud of our work. And so I'm sorry I'm a bit aggressive about this, but I hear this all the time, you know, and I'm tired of it. We work really hard, and we're trying to do what I call evidence-based research. That's what my friends, we do evidence-based research. It's a kind of thing where we are really trying. So no one wants to, and this is our ethic. It's a very small group of people who do this. No one wants to do this work because it is so hard. Imagine how long it takes to go through every vital record, every scrap of paper in a county courthouse, read every issue of every newspaper, do all of that, county after county after county. Nobody wants to do it. So we have this kind of ethic that the goal is not to be right. The goal is to get it right. Because why would you want to be wrong about something like this? So we're very patient people. Too patient for the OSU salary system. But, you know, it's being confirmed by a lot of people, what we're doing now. So I'm happy.
I'm fully sympathetic to your view. I'm just saying that I wish more of us did what you're doing.
Well, you know, I do too. It's a very, the thing is, you know, you go to, what's really weird is to go to these conventions and talk to young scholars, and they'll just say right to your face, like you know, these are people who are graduate students, they don't have jobs, and they say to you as a senior person in the field, they come, you know, what you do is just too hard. And I thought, I said, do you you might apply for a job at Ohio State someday. You don't want to say that. But it takes a long time. I mean, American Homicide took me 22 years because every theory went wrong. The first 10 years I had this theory, I ended up with junk after 10 years. And when you tell your chair at Ohio State after 10 years that you've got nothing but a lot of questions, you get punished. That's the way the system works here. Well, they can't punish me now. Well, they keep punishing me, but I'm kind of successful now. So that's okay, moderately successful.